believe in my eyes. I still believe in my eyes. Maybe it will change because obviously TV is working on that you don't even believe in your eyes. TV is using images in the same way, killing them. They don't look at them anymore. They're transmitting 1,000 of images per second, but you don't even look at them. An image is just when you see for the first time. And so to make a good picture is just to bring images or with the audience feel it's the first time. And they don't know, they are discovering. And when any kind of picture, even bad pictures, are successful, it's because you have a feeling it's the first time. I think people today want, especially with art pictures or essay pictures, want too much explanation. I mean, my picture don't need more explanation than a Steve McQueen picture.
What would you like us to remember?
One of the Lumiere's most famous cameramen, Alexandre Paumure, reputedly invented the first tracking shot in the history of cinema. When in Venice, Paumure had placed the camera on a boat and filmed the palaces fronting the Grand Canal as they passed by. Sending his minute-long film to Lyon, he confessed his doubts. Would the spectator, who was also totally new to the cinema, put up with this new type of movement which was so unnatural? Was it the palaces which moved all by themselves along the river? Would the audience be frightened by these masses of stone appearing to come toward them? Had these immobile buildings suddenly become mobile? We know the extent to which fear is a recurrent motif in the early years of the cinematograph. Spectators were astonished at having taken fright as much as they admired the representations capable of making them take fright. But what Paumure feared and what the first spectators were afraid of was not entirely of the same order. For the locomotive projected onto the screen of the Indian Salon at the Grand Café in Paris, which advanced toward the camera and thus toward us, the spectators, there is the recognition of a relatively banal phenomenon in a railway station, which becomes surprising in the salon of a Parisian café. There is displacement and estrangement, in Carlo Ginzburg's use of the term. But at the same time there is the apparently natural quality of the fixed shot, which gave the dual effect of transparency and reassurance. It is not the filming machine which is moving, but the other machine, the filmed locomotive. If the spectator does not notice the frame, it is above all because remaining fixed, it does not bring attention to itself. In the case of the palace on the Grand Canal, the movement is real. The frame moves at the whim of the boat which carries the camera. But Paumure was worried. Would this movement be perceived as such, as an innovation, a mobile cinematograph, or would it first be perceived, as was the case for all the other films on view at the time, as a non-movement, a fixed frame accommodating the movement of buildings in exactly the same way that the fixed frame accommodated the movement of a locomotive some months earlier? There was thus the risk of seeing something strange and disturbing, the buildings gliding along the water and moving across the image. Paumure feared that the spectators would confuse the perception of movement within the frame with that of the movement of the frame itself. Immobilized in their seats, the cinema's first spectators likely had difficulty in imagining that they were being carried by the movement of the camera. In any case, the question was posed. The movement in the frame appears more real than the movement of the frame. We know that the optical experiments put forth by Gestalt theory make us alternate between seeing the ground and seeing the figures of a drawing. According to this principle of alternation, I assume that the frame is not perceptible in and of itself at first. Its static immobility is perceptible, but the rectangle of light framed by darkness is not. To tell the truth, the frame is not made to be seen, and yet it is indeed there, as a cause and condition of the image, as the homothesis of the screen. It imposes itself, and the spectator's gaze submits to it. Now everything happens as if it were the gaze of the spectator onto the screen which was framed, and not the screen itself. If this is the case, then we have one of the first acts of violence carried out by the cinematic gesture. the gesture which makes us notice the frame. But because the image is surrounded by darkness, because we see it as simply a luminous rectangle cut out of the screen, the frame can in a certain manner remain invisible. An effort at accommodating it is needed to distinguish it, and not to keep to what it contains, to what it shows. We could understand Bazin's leitmotif in this light. When the window is opened, we can forget the reality of the frame and see the world grace us with its movements within the window frame, with the result that the latter is lost from our view and only the former occupies our thoughts. However, the perceptual denial of the frame fully participates in the naturalization of this cinematic operation. The train is above all a place where the immobile traveller is seated and watches a framed spectacle pass by. Here the homologous relationship between window and frame is underlined, much as it will be by the car windows so often filmed by Abbas Kiarostami. Fixed frame and moving world, as opposed to moving frame, fixed world. The question is no longer even posed. Everything takes place as if we had accepted movement being inverted in the same way we can turn a glove inside out. The real movement of the camera now leads to a synchronous imaginary movement in the spectator. Those inverse sensations at the beginning, those illusions in the illusion, were corrected, then forgotten and repressed. The imaginary displacement linked to the movements of the apparatus opens up, on the side of the spectator body, to an enjoyment of virtualization, ubiquity, and simultaneity. I am magically transported from place to place, the flying carpet of the screen, everywhere, throughout all ages. Instructed by this school, the cinema that is, the spectator reconstructs a coherence between his ordinary sensations, I am mobile in a fixed world, and what he feels in the cinema. It is the camera moving, not the setting. Once again, there is a naturalization of the scene. Permit me to leave Promio's question open. What if it was the world which really had moved in the frame? What if the historical advent of the cinema had arrived just in time to highlight this tipping point, this moment when the world itself began to vacillate?
I'm rather afraid that the alternative title to my book, Forget the Original, Just Get a Good Copy, is likely to offend the artistically sensitive. I apologize sincerely. The fault isn't entirely my own. Nowadays, editors insist on a controversial title. But you should be aware I am not an expert. I'm not an art historian. I'm certainly not recognized in this field. And more than anything, I'm not a member of the artistic establishment. It's my intention really just to try and show that the copy itself has worth, in that it leads us to the original and in this way certifies its value. And I believe this approach is not only valid in art. I was particularly pleased when a reader recently told me that he found in my work an invitation to self-inquiry, to a better understanding of the self. Questions about the concept of originality have been discussed throughout history and precede even the time when the Romans were selling copies of Egyptian silver artifacts. My own favorite story is of Lorenzo di Medici instructing Michelangelo to carve his statue of Cupid all'antica so it would fetch a better price. So this concern about originality, the notion of the false and the genuine, has always existed and occupied our ancestors' minds as much as it does ours today. The word original has itself for us very positive connotations. Authentic, genuine, reliable, lasting, possessing an intrinsic value. The etymology of the word too is interesting. The Latin root oriri means arising or being born, and I am particularly interested that the word original refers to birth. I would take the idea to its extreme and draw parallels between reproduction in art and reproduction in the human race. After all, it might be said, we are only the DNA replicas of our ancestors. Examining original works is therefore a process of questioning origins, of exploring the foundations of our civilization. Renaissance humanists searched into the roots of Western culture, encouraging a wider understanding of cultural heritage. This fascination with one's culture's origins is inextricably linked to the fundamental definition of originality. And with originality comes a need for authenticity, the need for cultural confirmation. Certifying the authenticity of works can therefore be seen as of fundamental importance.
Throughout the course of his career, Abbas Kiarostami became one of the foremost filmmakers interested in meta-commentary on the medium of film and the filmmaking process. This much is clear in a film like Life and Nothing More, which tells the story of a director who returns to the location of Where is the Friend's Home, Kiarostami's previous film, after the devastating earthquake of 1990, in search of the young boys who played the lead characters in that film. Kiarostami then completed this metatextual trilogy with Through the Olive Trees, a film that depicts a romance that emerged between two actors on set while shooting the previous film. These three films form a kind of mise en abîme, each commenting on and reframing the last, a kind of metatextual interplay that Kiarostami had previously explored in his 1990 masterpiece Close Up, which reenacts the story of a crime using the actual people involved, both the victims and the perpetrator. And of course, the crime itself adds another layer to this metatextuality, as the criminal was impersonating a filmmaker. Kiarostami's later film, Certified Copy, similarly blurs the line between fact and fiction. Halfway through the film, Juliette Binoche's character and the man she supposedly just met begin to act as if they're a married couple. Arguing, recalling memories, returning to the location of their honeymoon, their game takes over the narrative. And according to film critic Jonathan Rosenbaum, Kiarostami is interested in exposing the cinematic lie, the illusion of film. In his article Lessons from a Master, he writes that clarifying how and why the cinema lies is a central part of his enterprise. And commenting on Close Up, he contends that, beginning with one lie, Sabzian's impersonation, Kiarostami proceeded to generate several other lies, or at best half-truths, by getting all of the people to impersonate themselves and thereby promulgate their own versions of what happened. Close Up begins with the Soroush reporter and two policemen getting into a cab to go to the Arrancar residence and make the arrest. En route, the reporter cheerfully compares himself to Italian journalist Oriana Fallaci, clearly hoping his scoop will make him internationally famous, which is exactly what happened. As a result, one's sense of a manufactured news event is quickly established on several levels at once. The reporter, Sabzian, and Kiarostami are playing three different versions of the same game, each capitalizing on the awe and intimidation ordinary people feel about movies. By the time the film is over, every participant, including the family, the judge, Mac Malbaf, and the audience, has agreed to become an active part of the boondoggle. By focusing on the tale of an imposter, an impersonator, Kiarostami reveals another story of impersonation, the film itself. With all this focus on the illusion of the art, the imposture of the actor, it makes sense that his final fictional film, Like Someone in Love, would end like this. Throughout the film, Akiko's boyfriend threatens to expose the lie at the heart of her relationship with the old man Takashi. She's moonlighting as a high-end escort, and he hires her to have dinner with him, seemingly wanting her to play the part of another woman from his life. And mirroring the scene in Certified Copy, where Juliette Binoche doesn't correct the cafe owner who thinks Miller is her husband, when confronted with the boyfriend who believes him to be Akiko's grandfather, Takashi doesn't correct him either, choosing instead to play the role assigned to him. But this all comes to an end when the boyfriend finally uncovers the lie and tracks Akiko down to Takashi's apartment. The glass, the window, is the cinematic image, the plane of this illusion, and is a recurring motif not only throughout this film, but throughout Kiarostami's entire filmography. And so naturally, the film comes to an end when the window is shattered, when the lie can no longer be sustained.
آدم تو فیلم هر وقت که دیدیم، یعنی آدمایی که تو فیلم بازی کردن بعداً دیدیم، به نظر اومد خیلی کوچولوترن خودشون از واقعیتی که تو سینما داشتن. یا جایی که فیلم برداری شده وقتی رفتیم دیدیم گفتیم اینجا فیلم برداری کردن، اصلا باورم نمیشد که. علتش هم فکر کنم عمدتاً اینه که ما توی فیلم با یک احترام نشستیم داریم به یک اثر نگاه میکنیم. یک قدرت داستانیه، یعنی قدرت داستانگویی در واقع ما رو یه جوری یک واقعیت دیگه ای از اونجا به اون نشون میده که با واقعیت اصلیش اصلا هیچ جوری تناسبی نداره و همین دلیلم من فکر کنم این جزیره دقیقاً همون جزیره است ولی اصلا شباهتی به اون جزیره نداره و اینکه نگاه فلایرتی پشتش نیست، یعنی ما داریم بهش نگاه میکنیم، ما هم شرایط دیدن نداریم. اینکه ما توی فریم به ما نشون داد ولی ما آزادیم که سرمون میچرخه و اصلا اون قدرت تمرکزی که تو سینما راجع به یه اثر میکنیم مطلقا نمیتونیم توی واقعیت بکنیم. اینکه همون تمرکز نداریم و هدایت نمیشیم، به همین دلیل میچرخیم و اون چیزی که باید ببینیم نمیبینیم. به نظر من کادر شدنه، یعنی من یه عکس میگیرم واقعا نمیدونم که عکس رو چاپ بکنم یا نکنم ولی روی شک برای چاپش میکنم، بعد به مجرم که اونو میذارمش توی یک فریم سفید پاسپارتو به نظرم کاملا دیدنی تر میشه. بعد وقتی که میذارمش توی فریم قابش میکنم و پشتیش نگاش میکنم کاملا پذیرفتنی، یعنی به نظرم میاد که اعتبار اون فریم یا کادر شدن به اندازه خود اثره که ما در واقع محدود بکنیم به جایی رو و این احترام و اعتبار و احترام رو بهش بدیم که ما اینو انتخابش کردیم توی فریم. به مجرد که انتخاب رو میکنی یک والور دیگه پیدا میکنه، یک اعتبار ثانوی پیدا میکنه که جدا میکنه خودش از بقیه.
In his book The Material Ghost, Gilberto Perez takes issue with this rather simplistic view of Kiarostami's work, as simply exposing the illusions of cinema. In commenting on Rosenbaum's assessment of Close-Up, Perez writes, "For Rosenbaum, impersonation is indeed a crime of which everybody here is guilty, though Kiarostami wins acquittal because he is seen to plead guilty. This is a postmodern view of the matter, the view that everybody lies, artists and politicians, institutions and individuals alike, that there's no such thing as the truth, and even if there were, you couldn't get to it anyway, that the only thing to be done is a critique, an assertion that you're not being taken in. This may be the view we've come to in our society of the spectacle, but it is not the view Kiarostami expresses in his film. In Perez's view, Kiarostami doesn't stop at this surface-level deconstruction of cinema's illusionistic qualities. He relates Kiarostami's work to a larger trend, the tension between naturalism and modernism in art. He cites Faulkner and Joyce, two writers deeply entrenched in modernism who very much retain certain naturalistic sensibilities. This is because the more the artist seeks to faithfully depict reality, the more they become aware of the limitations of their medium in depicting said reality, that perhaps insurmountable schism between art and reality. But according to Perez, Kiarostami's work expresses an important development in this relation between naturalism and modernism. Analyzing his 1989 documentary Homework, Perez writes, "Homework acknowledges the artifice of its making, the fiction that enters into it. Kiarostami shows himself and the equipment and technicians that flank him as he interviews working-class children at their school. He shows the camera, the mechanical eye that stares at the children like an exacting schoolmaster as they answer the questions being put to them. He shows the means of representation plainly, without fuss, not to make a show of artifice, but, and here again naturalism leads naturally to modernism, because they are part of the reality represented. The children respond to the camera, and we must see the camera they see if we are to understand their response. Their lies, for example. They all say they like doing homework better than they like watching cartoons on television. The children are intimidated, not because Kiarostami is particularly intimidating, but because these working-class children are already intimidated by authority, and they answer what they think is expected of them. The exacting eye of the camera exacts lies. The children in Homework may lie, but their lying is part of their truth. They cower before the camera's authority as they cower before all the authorities that rule their lives. On their faces we often see bruises. Shyly, without presuming to complain, mumbling at times so we can hardly hear them, they talk about the punishment they receive from their teachers and their parents and their older siblings. This is the time of the war with Iraq, when Saddam Hussein was as officially demonized in Iran as he was here during Bush's Gulf War. Documentary is supposed to be direct, but Homework proceeds obliquely and even metaphorically, as no doubt it must in order to work under an authoritarian system that rules not over kids alone, but over filmmaking as well. The camera the children see as an authority, we come to see as itself under the authority the children fear. According to Perez, the film examines not only what the camera does to its subjects, but also what the historical context does to the camera. Kiarostami makes with remarkable naturalness the move from naturalism to modernism, from the representation of reality to the representation as part of reality of the means of representation. He concludes that, for Kiarostami, for the society in which he works, art counts, and counts not just as a critique telling us to discount it. Art is a construction and must be recognized as such, but that doesn't mean that the only thing to be done about it is deconstruction.
انقدر این مبحث گسترده‌ای که واقعا من از کجا شروع کنم و چجوری بگم و حتی به یک دلیل که من چجوری خود این دوتا رو تجربه کردم توی کارم و توی زندگیم از وقتی که کشف کردم کدوم بخش من واقعیت منه و کدوم بخش رویای منه و چرا من این بازی از رویا به واقعیت رو از واقعیت به رویا رو اینقدر تو زندگی معمولی نه به عنوان یه فیلمساز دارم و بیشتر از اونجا که کشف کردم که این اصلا مربوط به یک کارگردان نیست، مربوط به یک روشنفکر نیست، مربوط به تمام طبقاته و این تنها حس رویا کردن مهمترین چیزی است که بین تمام خلق الله تقسیم شده به نسبت، نه به نسبت، به اندازه. حالا بعضی ما میتونیم راجع به رویاهامون حرف بزنیم، بقیه نمیتونن حرف بزنن و میتونن رویا بکنن. یعنی رویا کردن در واقع یکی از بارزترین خصوصیاتی است که یکی از پدیده‌های شگرفی است که به نظر من به انسان عطا شده به یه شکلی. میگم ما راجع به بقیه خصوصیاتمون مثل حس بینایی، چشایی، شنوایی و بقیه مطلعیم و گاهی هم شاکریم بابت اینا، اما راجع به این که میتونیم تخیل بکنیم هیچ وقت فکر نکردیم که چه امکانات عظیمی در اختیار ماست بابت رویا کردن و اصلا فانکشن این رویا چی، از کجا آمده، چرا ما میتونیم رویا کنیم و چرا باید رویا کنیم. اگر این عمل کردی در زندگی ما نداره اساسش بر چیه، چرا، از کجا آمده. خب ریشش رو در این دیدم که خب ما چه مواقعی بهش پناه میبریم، مواقعی که از شرایطمون احساس نارضایتی میکنیم و چه سیستم غریبی هم هست که هیچ سیستم دیکتاتوری دو جهان بزرگترینش نمیتونه کنترل کنه. یعنی هیچ سیستم تفتیش عقاید نمیتونه کنترل بکنه رویا کردن تو رو میتونه جسماً در یک زندان، در یک سلول حبس بکنن، اما تو این توانایی داری که مثلا در دوران محکومیتت که چندین ساله عمدتاً خارج از اونجا به سر ببری بدون که کسی بتونه تو رو کنترل کنه. در واقع با شکل رویا کردن تو از دیوارهای صعب العبور میگذری بدون اینکه اثری به جا بذاری و برمیگردی. حالا باز برگشتن به نظر من خب ما میگیم وقتی میریم بیرون چرا برمیگردیم؟ این اون اعتبار واقعیته که تو باید برگردی به واقعیت برای اینکه ببینی واقعیت چیه. در واقع از طریق رویا کردن این شانس رو داری که تحمل بکنی بعضی از سختی‌های زندگی که غیر قابل تغییرن. یعنی میری بیرون رویا میکنی، تر و تازه تر برمیگردی. مثل میگم فضای اتاقی که وقتی خفه و بسته است پنجره رو باز میکنی و رو به بیرون و اجازه میدی که هوا داخل اتاق بشه و یا خودت حس نفس میکشی. رویا یه پنجره است به نظر من به زندگی ما.
Young people from all over the globe are joining up to fight for the future.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part.
I'm doing my part too.
They're doing their part. Are you?
Paul Verhoeven is a controversial filmmaker. He began his career consistently making films that tackled sensitive and transgressive subject matter, and in recent years he seems to have returned to his roots, with the low-budget psychosexual dramas Elle and Benedetta. But in the late 80s and 90s, Verhoeven conquered Hollywood with a series of films that were, for the most part, financial successes. RoboCop, Basic Instinct, and Total Recall being the most notable examples. However, the critical reception of his films has not been so consistent. While the over-the-top satirical sci-fi of RoboCop was already well received at the time, the kitsch extravagance of Showgirls and interplanetary CGI warfare of Starship Troopers, on the other hand, would not gain their status as cult classics until years later. And a big part of the reassessment of these films has been centered on interpreting their message, their framing of genre elements which, at the time, were perhaps perceived as somewhat lowbrow. Showgirls is the film which has seen the most significant of reappraisals, going from offensively trashy and inappropriate to underrated feminist satire. But I think that with these two films in particular, a focus on the mechanics of their satire has gotten in the way of an analysis that would make sense of these satirical elements on the level of meta-narrative. Which is to say that what these movies are actually about, in my opinion, is their relation to an audience.
We have the ships. We have the weapons. We need soldiers. Soldiers like Lieutenant Stack Lumbridge.
The ending of Starship Troopers is not simply an explicit reminder of the propagandistic nature of this kind of war movie, it's a reminder that these movies talk to you and shape you, the moviegoer, directly. The biggest mistake one could make in interpreting Starship Troopers would be to think that you're above the thing it's satirizing. Same goes for Showgirls. One thing that's almost entirely omitted from that film is the audience of this show. The people paying to see it, the culture which enables it. It's important to remember that the film itself is a lap dance, and you're the lap. But Starship Troopers and Showgirls aren't the only films in Verhoeven's filmography that subtly, or not so subtly, point to the audience's position in the cinematic experience. Indeed, Total Recall is perhaps Verhoeven's most explicit indictment of Hollywood's function as ideological apparatus. The film is set in 2084 and tells the story of a construction worker named Douglas Quaid who one day decides to pay a visit to a company that offers the peculiar service of implanting in your mind memories of a vacation that you never actually took. Unfortunately, the operation has the effect of seemingly awakening hidden memories of Quaid's life as a secret agent on Mars. This leads to Quaid realizing that his entire life is a lie. He's not who he thought he was. Douglas Quaid is simply a fabrication, and his wife is actually a spy who's been watching over him this entire time. And throughout the film there's a through line of doubt in Quaid's mind about the veracity of these events. After all, it could all simply be the fictions of the fake vacation implanted in his mind, and the film even ends with him asking explicitly if it was all a dream. But the premise of this film is particularly interesting and significant in my view because it appears to echo an important sentiment that emerged in film theory in the 60s and 70s. As Jean-Luc Godard wrote in 1963, the cinema substitutes our gaze with a world in harmony with our desires. And this idea that film, and more generally the movie-going experience, in some way replaces our perception of reality with an illusion constructed through filmic technologies is the central premise of apparatus theory. This is a notion that would come to dominate a particular strand of film criticism in the second half of the 20th century, notably in the writings of Le Cahiers du Cinéma, perhaps the most influential film publication of all time. In the 60s, Le Cahiers would take an explicitly political turn, and the film theory of the time was very much coloured by the ideas of thinkers like Jacques Lacan, Roland Barthes, and the Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser, whose concept of the state apparatus would become central to this politically minded analysis of cinema. Althusser, in his essay essay Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus puts an emphasis on the means by which the state perpetuates its ideology from within. He examines the ways in which modes of production are reproduced and maintained through the relationship between state and subject. He posits that a state is able to maintain control by continually shaping subjects who believe that their position within the current social and political structure is natural. It's just how it is. In short, a subject, like you and I, defines themselves in conjunction with these institutions, these ideologies of the state, and thus through their very existence as subject of these institutions, they serve to propagate and perpetuate the ideologies on which they depend. We are constantly positioning ourselves in relation to this dominant ideology. We are constantly being told stories and telling ourselves stories about our position within this societal mechanism, and thus over time it becomes harder and harder to extricate ourselves from its framework. And in the works of contemporary film theorists, these ideas were transposed to the realm of cinema, questioning the audience's identification as subject of the cinematic experience. How does film mystify its ideological underpinnings through the spectacle of narrative illusion? As you can see, this was a film theory built on suspicion, and one of the main thinkers of this period was Jean-Louis Baudry. In his influential essay, Ideological Effects of the Apparatus, Baudry explores the core of the cinematic illusion. In one passage, he states that cinematographic specificity, what distinguishes cinema from other systems of signification, thus refers to a work, that is, to a process of transformation. The question becomes, is the work made evident? Does consumption of the product bring about a knowledge effect, or is the work concealed? If the latter, consumption of the product will obviously be accompanied by ideological surplus value. Althusser opposes ideology to knowledge or science. Ideology operates by obfuscating the means by which it is produced. Thus, an increase in ideological value is an increase in mystification. What this means is that throughout the course of a film's production, a lot of work is done to get us from the objective reality being filmed by the camera to the end result we see projected at the theatre. And while filmmakers like Godard or Jean-Marie Straub and Daniel Huillet may bring attention to the modes of cinematic production through, for example, a particular use of editing, or the use of direct sound or non-professional actors that remind us of the work being done, Hollywood productions generally follow specific formulas which seek to maintain the fiction, maintain the illusion of cinema, at the expense of reality. In other words, when watching a mainstream Hollywood movie, we are generally not aware, or at least not made to be aware, of the actor's presence as a working actor in a production. They are lost in the role, lost in the character. We are not conscious of the locations as constructed sets. They are lost in the fictional world, the environment. We are not aware of the editing as an artificial process of cutting together fragments of film. This process is lost to the narrative and its logical progression and continuity. A good, successful movie is one that makes us forget all of that artificiality, all of that work that went into crafting this illusion. Baudry's point is that in order to sustain these illusions, the viewer becomes a subject, and is acted upon ideologically. We are made to lose ourselves in a world and identify with its hero. We are positioned in a certain sense, and the narrative is that which holds the experience together and obfuscates the work in order to maintain and perpetuate the continuity of narrative. Baudry writes, "Continuity is an attribute of the subject. It supposes the subject and it circumscribes his place. The search for such narrative continuity, so difficult to obtain from the material base, can only be explained by an essential ideological stake projected in this point. It is a question of preserving, at any cost, the synthetic unity of the locus where meaning originates, the subject." Which is to say that these movies are very much invested in maintaining the audience member's position as subject, what Baudry calls the transcendental function to which narrative continuity points back. The narrative illusion only functions because of this subject for whom it is constructed. As Althusser himself stated, there is no ideology except by the subject and for the subjects. And the most important means of cinema's positioning of the subject in the narrative is the camera. the camera's outlook, its particular framing, are what the subject really identifies with. Baudry states that the spectator identifies less with what is represented, the spectacle itself, than with what stages the spectacle, makes it seen, obliging him to see what it sees. In other words, it is the perspective of the camera that becomes the guiding principle of the subject's identification. And so the cinematic apparatus functions the same way as the state apparatus, and thus contributes to the same ideological effect. Everything happens as if the subject himself, being unable, and for a reason, to account for his own situation, it was necessary to substitute secondary organs, grafted on to replace his own defective ones, instruments or ideological formations capable of filling his function as subject. In fact, this substitution is only possible on the condition that the instrumentation itself be hidden or repressed. Another French thinker, Jean-Louis Comolli, who served as editor-in-chief for Les Cahiers du Cinéma from 66 to 78, also explored this relationship between the audience and the illusion of cinema in his essay Machines of the Visible. However, Comolli posits that the audience isn't simply a passive subject being indoctrinated by a movie's ideology. He says that the spectator works too. And in this essay, he essentially details the history of the audience's suspension of disbelief, as it developed alongside the technological developments of film that allowed for more realistic representations of reality. He explains that in the early days of cinema, there was a lack in terms of authentic representation of reality. Film wasn't capable of reproducing reality with the kind of fidelity that modern technologies allow, and because of this, the audience was aware of the artifice of cinema, but they wanted to believe anyway. They were willing to go along, they were complicit. And early cinema played on this willingness to accept the artifice, because if it were to pretend to be realistic, it wouldn't be believable. Comolli writes, "It was absolutely necessary that cinema facilitate the disavowal of the veritable sensory castrations which founded its specificity, and that it not, by remarking them, prevent such disavowal. Compromises were necessary in order that the cinema could function as ideological apparatus, in order that its delusion could take place." The sensory castrations Comolli describes here are the aspects of cinematic representation that clash with our perception of reality. In short, the unbelievable parts, and drawing attention to them such that they also become part of the cinematic spectacle and not an obstacle to it was vital in these early films. For Comolli, it is important to envision cinema as participating in the development of historic processes of representation. He says, "A society is only such in that it is driven by representation. If the social machine manufactures representations, it also manufactures itself from representations, the latter operative at once as means, matter, and conditions of sociality." Thus, the historical variation of cinematic techniques, their appearance, disappearance, their phases of convergence, their periods of dominance and decline, seem to me to depend not on a rational linear order of technological perfectibility, nor an autonomous instance of scientific progress, but much rather on the offsettings, adjustments, arrangements carried out by a social configuration in order to represent itself, that is, it wants to grasp itself, identify itself, and itself produce itself in its representation. The kinds of representations of reality that we find in a medium like film emerge downstream of whatever social configuration that would produce or necessitate this kind of representation. Technological developments do not by themselves dictate the level of realism in film. Rather, they themselves are the result of a pre-existing demand for realistic representation. What happened with the invention of cinema? It was not sufficient that it be technically feasible. It was not sufficient that a camera, a projector, a strip of images be technically ready. It was necessary that something else be constituted, that something else be formed. The cinema machine, which is not essentially the camera, the film, the projector, which is not merely a combination of instruments, apparatuses, techniques, which is a machine, a dispositif articulating between one another different sets, technological certainly, but also economic and ideological. A dispositif was required which implicate its motivations, which be the arrangement of demands, desires, fantasies, speculations, in the two senses of commerce and the imaginary. An arrangement that give apparatus and techniques a social status and function. Or as Gilles Deleuze puts it, the tools always presuppose a machine, and the machine is always social before it is technical. And so the development of an audience's willingness or unwillingness to believe in the illusion, the representation offered by cinema, corresponds to a development in whatever ideological, technological, and economic arrangements constitute the background, the social apparatus at any given time. And this kind of back and forth that occurs between an audience and the artifice of cinema brings us back to a pivotal scene in Total Recall, because at the midpoint of the movie, the film explicitly addresses the obvious question: is this really happening, or is it all part of the fake vacation?
What do you want?
Well, this is going to be very difficult for you to accept, Mr. Quaid.
I'm listening.
I'm afraid you're not really standing here right now. You're not here, and neither am I.
That's amazing. Where are we?
At Recall. You're strapped into an implant chair, and I'm monitoring you from the psychoprobe console.
I get it. I'm dreaming. And all this is part of the delightful vacation your company has sold me.
Not
right?
exactly.
And while this scene is great because it gets ahead of any anticipated final act twist, it also plays into this idea that one way of making a movie more believable is by drawing attention to its lack, playing off the audience's doubt, managing their suspension of disbelief. And this gets hammered home again with the ending. Of course, the point is not simply that the film is playing with the audience's superficial tendency to expect some kind of big twist, like the ending of Inception, for example. The point the film is making is that all of this was, in fact, a dream, our collective fantasy. And when the film ends, we wake up from this fantasy. In trying to speculate about the inner logic of the film, we forget the obvious meta-narrative being created, one that is meant to remind us of the illusionistic conditions under which the Hollywood movie places us. Every time we go to the cinema, we effectively pay for a fake vacation, one that can only exist as the historical culmination of a multiplicity of technological, economic, and political realities, guided every step of the way by ideological forces, a social apparatus which finds itself realized in cinema. And I'll end this video with a quote from Walter Benjamin's seminal essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where he writes, "Throughout the workday in offices and factories, city dwellers have to relinquish their humanity in the face of an apparatus. In the evening, these same masses fill the cinemas to witness the film actor taking revenge on their behalf, not only by asserting his humanity against the apparatus, but by placing that apparatus in the service of his triumph." And so, Total Recall is simply a big, explosive reminder of every moviegoer's position within this ideological apparatus. And we should never be so arrogant as to think that we know for sure the answer to the question,
What if this is a dream?
Well, then kiss me quick before you wake up.
Je me demande si notre marche vers la technique n'est pas tout simplement l'annonciateur de la décadence complète. D'abord, écoutez, la perfection technique ne peut créer que l'ennui, puisque elle n'est que la reproduction de la nature. Admettez que nous arrivions au cinéma à donner l'impression parfaite d'une forêt. Nous aurons des arbres avec l'épaisseur de l'écorce, nous aurons des écrans encore plus grands, des écrans qui feront le tour du spectateur. Et nous sommes vraiment au milieu de la forêt. Nous pourrons toucher les troncs d'arbres, nous respirerons l'odeur de la forêt. Il y aura des machines automatiques qui dispenseront des parfums imitant l'odeur de la mousse. Alors, vous savez ce qui arrivera? Il arrivera qu'on prendra une Vespa et qu'on ira dans une vraie forêt, qu'on n'ira plus au cinéma. Pourquoi foutre voulez-vous aller s'embêter dans une salle de spectacle quand on peut avoir le vrai? Donc, l'imitation de la nature, n'est-ce pas, ne peut créer que la fin d'un art.
تعدد کپی ها و سالهای دراز تماشای کپی هاست که ما رو مقابل اصل میخکوب میکنه و نفس رو تو سینما حبس میکنه. ما هممون که متخصص نیستیم که مقابل اصل وایسیم و درکش کنیم. بدون وجود کپی ها ما اصل رو درک نمی کردیم یا لااقل نکته که در این هست که اونو من بیشتر بهش اعتقاد دارم اینه که دسترسی به اصل در بضاعت خیلی از ماها نیست، بنابراین قدر کپی رو بدونیم، اونه که مهمه.
While several of Godard's films were met with something less than enthusiasm when they first appeared, Les Carabiniers seems to have evoked a particularly acrimonious response, so acrimonious in fact that the film was withdrawn almost immediately after it was released. Reading Godard's response to this disheartening episode, we discover that virtually the entire arsenal of orthodox derogation was directed against the film. The work was described as being confusing, incoherent, and boring, an abominable figuration in which one has been served scraps in the guise of farce, photographed as if it were a piece of salvage work in which every image expresses the author's abiding scorn for the public. Even though the film no longer provokes quite the same degree of scorn it once did, it is still one of Godard's least liked films. Even this more mildly negative response seems to me unwarranted and, indeed, distressing. I find the film extraordinarily intriguing. My pique over this comes not from the damage I fear might happen by slighting the works. At this point in history, Godard's films are well beyond the need for defense. Rather, it results from my belief that Les Carabiniers is a key film in Godard's oeuvre, in the sense that the issues that the film treats are central to all his works, and that in this work, the problematic with which he mostly deals found paradigmatic formulation. Let us begin by summarizing the major tenets of the received view of the film. Most commentaries on the film begin with the description of the piece as an anti-war film. Ian Cameron's, for example, contains the claim that Les Carabiniers is a series of propositions about war. It is the nearest Godard has come to making a statement movie. While it certainly is an anti-war film of sorts, it is a very odd one indeed, one that contains many features which cannot be explained by considering it as simply an anti-war film. Indeed, what have proven for most people to be the film's two most memorable scenes, the scene in which the soldiers first attend a film screening and the scene in which they arrive home with suitcases full of photographs, could not be explained on a description of the film as nothing but an anti-war piece. Nor could the fact that the tension between the film's fable-like form and its realistic texture is so central to the film. The main problem with the canonical view, I would contend, is that it is based on the assumption that the anecdote the film recounts is the locus of the film's meaning. If I can be forgiven for indulging myself with a few general comments against that view, I should like to argue that the anecdote a film presents is never, and this I think is more than usually true in the case of Godard's films, fully analyzable in itself. Rather, the meaning of a film lies in its structure, i.e. in the system of elements and relations which constitute the work. This is why two films can recount the same anecdote, i.e. recount the same story of the same characters involved in the same incidents, and yet have different meanings. Different adaptations from the same novel and made-over versions of earlier films have surely proven that. The anecdote is merely one set of relations within a film's total structure. It is the total structure which constitutes a film's meaning. But how do we interpret a structure? The question is too general to be answered in the space of this paper, but apropos of Godard's work, I should like to point out that his work, in common with the work of many others such as Antonioni who work in a quasi-narrative mode, frequently contains what I like to call capsulizing partial structures, episodes or scenes which reflect in miniature the structure of the work as a whole. Such passages assemble in a condensed space many of the same elements which occur in the film as a whole, and thus enable the spectator to form some notion about the overall meaning of the film. One identifying trait of capsulizing partial structures is that they are often marked off from the rest of the text in some way and have therefore the appearance of being distinct units unto themselves. Let us assume that these last scenes do in fact capsulize the film's meaning. What then would we hypothesize about the film's meaning? To answer this question, let us begin by examining the sequence in which the riflemen attend the screening of a film for the first time. The film show begins with the projection of footage of a train pulling into a railway station and of a domestic scene of a tiny child being fed. These two scenes are recreations using contemporary props, costumes and settings of items included in the first program exhibited by those pioneering filmmakers, the Lumières. The reference to the work of the Lumières is multiply suggestive. At the first film screening in 1895, when the Lumières showed L'arrivée du train à la gare de Ciotat, the model for the train sequence the riflemen watch, the audience went into something of a panic, fearing that they might be struck by the train which, apparently, was hurtling toward them. It appears Godard had this famous episode in mind when making his recreation, for Michel-Ange's response to the image of the moving train is to cover his face with his hands. Like the spectator at the first film showing, he was frightened by the image of the moving train. The sequence illustrates Godard's ideas on the relationship of the spectator to the cinematic image. By means of the allusion to the episode of panic which occurred at the first screening of films, Godard points out that the cinematographic image's power over the spectator depends on its realistic appearance and its power to convince the spectator that it does not represent reality, but is reality. To convince the spectator, that is to say, that it possesses the same degree of reality as that of which it is an image. There is an additional significance to the passage, an esoteric significance, for it depends upon one's prior acquaintance with Godard's views on the traditional understanding of the role the Lumières played in developing film styles and film forms. The early cinema is traditionally considered to have harbored two divergent ambitions, the desire to recreate fantasy and the desire to document reality. The Lumières films are generally considered to have been inspired by the second aspiration. They are in fact frequently cited as defining the proto-realistic film style. But Godard has claimed that it is quite incorrect to view the Lumières as the first documentarians. He claims that they are, among early filmmakers, the true fantasists, for in their work one finds the same scenes, seascapes, street scenes and railway stations, presented in the same manner as in the work of the Impressionist painters. According to Godard, the Lumières films, although they appear on the surface to be realistic documentaries, are in fact fantasies. A very similar claim could equally well be made for Les Carabiniers, underneath the realistic surface of which there is what amounts to a fable, complete with peasants, soldiers, kings, wars, and excursions to exotic lands. Godard's allusions to the Lumières films then indicate that he is interested in the way that the properties of film allow fiction to disguise itself as reality, artifice to pass as the natural. The second piece screened is a scene of a baby's feeding. Like the first, Godard's reconstruction closely follows the pattern of the original Lumières piece, at least until the feeding erupts into anger, with the father cursing his little son with the terms superboy and fascist whore. The inclusion of this cursing can be considered as providing a commentary on the original Lumière film, for at one level the scene functions as a parody of that form of artwork, and Godard seems to be suggesting that the Lumière's films are just another example of the form which presents a purified and sweetened version of scenes from bourgeois life, and especially bourgeois family life. By including the episodes usually omitted from realistic bourgeois art, Godard is effectively denouncing its claims to present the truth. In this way, then, the lack of any real truthfulness of the Lumière's films, of film in general, and of bourgeois realism is implied. But the terms in which the abuse is phrased are themselves significant. The father's use of the epithets superboy and fascist whore suggests that he is condemning the child for his feelings of grandiosity, and his refusal to recognize the need to bend to his father's will. The significance of those feelings of grandiosity shall become clear shortly. Even more clearly than the first, the third segment was chosen to illustrate aspects of Godard's view on the spectator's relation to a cinematographic image. It too is a recreation of an early film, one that portrayed a femme de monde taking a bath. Godard uses the scene to comment on scopophilia, the pleasure attained through the act of looking. The basis for the passage is Michel-Ange's belief that he is seeing not a film but the actual event. Associated with this is his mistaken identification of the camera's point of view with his own. These confusions lead him to believe that by changing his point of view, a different aspect of the event will be revealed. Thus, when the woman taking the bath walks off the left side of the screen, Michel-Ange leans to the right, hoping in this way to bring her back into view. When she returns and climbs into the bath, he first cranes up in his seat, trying to peer over the edge of the bathtub which hides her lower parts, then climbs up on the ledge in front of the screen and jumps into the air, still trying to achieve a point of view from which his voyeuristic desires can be fulfilled. His attempts come to an end when he tries to pull himself up onto the screen and to enter into the image, but succeeds only in bringing down the screen upon himself. The projection of the film continues in spite of the fallen screen, only now the image is projected on the newly uncovered brick wall. Godard filmed the entire episode with his camera facing directly towards the surface of the screen. Thus, after Michel-Ange brings the screen down on top of himself, Godard's viewer, like Michel-Ange, is confronted with the flat surface of a brick wall. In this way, Godard emphasizes the two-dimensionality of the film image and exposes the fact that the deep space which Michel-Ange aspired to enter is only an illusion. A film image is actually as flat and as impenetrable as a brick wall.
Je vois Henri Langlois qui a bondi de ce que j'ai posé à Jean Renoir, à ce que j'ai affirmé devant Jean Renoir, qu'il n'y avait pas de mise en scène chez Lumière.
Je pense que c'est simplement une illusion. Une illusion qui vient du fait que le film actuellement a 1500 mètres, 300 mètres, 250 mètres, donc on colle bout à bout des morceaux. Le problème, à la découverte du cinéma, on avait X mètres, pas plus. Il fallait donc, en X mètres, composer quelque chose. Quand on regarde très attentivement les films Lumière, ça a l'air très spontané, on a posé la caméra dans la rue, c'est la rue qui passe, et si c'est très savant, si ça bouleverse, on se dit c'est le hasard. Or, ce n'est pas le hasard, parce que vous avez par exemple les prises de lumière qui sont évidentes. Par exemple, quand vous voyez par exemple dans un film de Louis Lumière, comme par hasard, il y a une question de chronomètre. Vous avez un film, il dure tant, puisque le plan dure tant. Bon, comme par hasard, ça commence avec un tramway qui entre dans l'image, à droite, puis il y a tout un mouvement, puis ça s'achève par un tramway qui entre dans l'image, à gauche. Vous croyez que c'est un hasard? Pas du tout un hasard. Ils ont repéré, ils ont vu pendant un certain temps comment ça se passait, ils ont choisi le meilleur angle de prise de vue, et ils ont réussi la chose la plus extraordinaire, la chose qu'on a oubliée, c'est que dans ces quelques secondes, ils ont réussi à mettre dans une image, sans changer la place de la caméra, le maximum de plans. Vous avez des gros plans, vous avez des plans rapprochés, vous avez des plans américains, vous avez des plans d'ensemble, et vous avez un mouvement qui unit tout ça. Et ce n'est pas le hasard, c'est la science.
Throughout my analysis of the cinema sequence, I have been suggesting that Les Carabiniers is a self-reflexive film. In this scene, this self-reflexiveness reaches its apogee. This is hardly surprising, for the scene embodies Godard's reflection on many of the concepts which are encapsulated in the general notion of realism in film. The scene points out the illusory character of the film image, demonstrates that the apparent depth it possesses functions to support the image's illusionistic properties, suggests that the appeal of illusionistic images depends upon the spectator's scopophilic drives, and reveals how the scopophilic drive operates to forge a relationship of identification between the viewer and the camera. But central as well to an understanding of the dynamics of this sequence is the reference mentioned earlier to the child's feelings of grandiosity. of omnipotence. For the bathing scene did elicit a truly childish sort of response from Michel-Ange. This notion of grandiosity is central to an understanding both of Michel-Ange's responses to the films and of the action of the pair of riflemen throughout the rest of the film. It should be pointed out that instances of childish behavior proliferate in the film. In one scene, Michel-Ange and Ulysses require a woman they are holding at gunpoint to stand on a chair with her back towards them. They then lift her skirt with their rifles and inspect her. When satisfied, they force her to partially disrobe and to kneel down. They set themselves astraddle her and force her to carry them about the room on her hands and knees. They are, of course, behaving very much like young boys who crawl under their mother's skirts in order to try and sort out the mysteries of an anatomy different from their own. They also exhibit the gullibility and ingenuousness of a young child. When one member of the press gang tells them that he has a personal letter to them from the king, they are practically ready to join up. The paper the soldier shows them is clearly only a printed form. The received view of Les Carabiniers has it that the purpose of this characterizing the riflemen as childlike is social comment. By so characterizing Ulysses and Michel-Ange, Godard is suggesting, also the canonical view has it, that war is childish activity engaged in by men who do not understand what they are doing. Such men, it is said, engage in war only to serve a distant master whom they deify, but who does not spare even a thought for their interests. It seems to me that the use of such playful, childlike characters in an anti-war film would be highly irresponsible. I think the use of such characters is essential to Godard's presentation of his thoughts on realism. My conclusion is based on two scenes in particular, though I believe other scenes confirm it. The first of these two scenes is that in which soldiers from the press gang, having recognized Michel-Ange's and Ulysses' gullibility and convinced them that the king has written them a personal letter asking for their help, coax the two young men to leave with them. The tack they use to lure them into the war is to describe the booty that could be theirs. Essentially, they tell Michel-Ange and Ulysses that in war they can take whatever they want. Michel-Ange and Ulysses are amazed. As though to confirm their understanding, they list for the soldiers' assent the things they want to take. In the later scene, Michel-Ange and Ulysses return home bringing with them their booty, which turns out to be hundreds of pictures, all arranged into bundles according to a taxonomy which, Michel-Ange explains, ensures that pictures of things of every conceivable type are included in their loot. While the women complain about the worthlessness of these pictorial spoils, Michel-Ange and Ulysses seem delighted. To counter the reprimands of the cupidinous women, they argue essentially that an image of a thing is as valuable as the thing itself. The argument takes two forms, what might be called a strong form and a weak form. Rephrasing them for the sake of brevity, the strong form consists in the claim that the image of a thing belongs to the same order of reality as does the thing itself. The weak form consists in the claim that the image of the thing acts as a token of the thing that can be cashed in and exchanged for the thing. Both arguments are based on a form of primary process thinking, in which the mental image of an object is able to provide the same pleasure as the object itself does. That is why both forms of the argument involve the claim that the possession of the image of something is as every bit as good as actually having the thing. This form of thinking is characteristic of the child, and, in the earliest stages of mental development, is the basis of magical thinking through which the child feels that their desire can actually produce whatever it is they desire. Hence the child feels omnipotent, and feeling omnipotent, they recognize no moral law. Michel-Ange's and Ulysses' behavior suggests this form of thinking. War appealed to them because it allowed them to have everything they wanted. That is, it allowed them to return to the omnipotent stage. This return accounts for their amorality, which allows them to answer every question about their exploits with the banal comment, "They said we could," since the omnipotent child knows no morality. I believe that it is exactly to suggest this reliance on early forms of thought that Godard depicts Ulysses and Michel-Ange as so childlike. What Godard seems to be implying in all this is that the photographic image returns the viewer to the stage at which an image can substitute for an object in providing gratification. It is precisely this power to reawaken forms of magical thinking that constitutes the realistic effects of the image. I have wanted to establish that Les Carabiniers, far from being primarily an anti-war film, is basically a reflection on realism in the cinema.
Vénus! Vénus! Regarde, Vénus!
Many of the same issues we discovered in Les Carabiniers also appear in another gun story made by Godard, Le Petit Soldat. The hero of that film too is a man under the sway of images. Bruno Forestier defines himself in terms of his image of himself. What matters to him is how he is seen, both by others and, more importantly, by himself. His intense and passionate involvement with images influences his relationship to other people. He falls in love with Veronica when he makes an image of her. For him, beauty is the colour of a woman's eyes or the way she moves and nothing more. Like Michel-Ange and Ulysses, Bruno Forestier takes the image as reality itself. Since he seems to believe that the appearance of something is its reality, for him, its appearance must reveal its real nature. Thus he can say when photographing Veronica, to photograph a face is to photograph the soul behind it. Photography is truth, and the cinema is truth 24 times a second. It is a small wonder, considering the degree of faith he puts in images, that his ambition for his life is to open an art gallery. Behind this faith, however, is intense doubt. The doubt arises from feelings that things and people are indefinite and inscrutable. He recognizes, for example, that his own private self is unknowable by others, for he points out, using a language of gestures, that while he sees himself from inside looking outwards, others see him from the outside looking inwards. Against this uncertainty and doubt, Bruno seeks images of both himself and Veronica that are clear and definite. Bruno is jeopardized by his faith in images. He believed he knew Veronica profoundly just because he had photographed her. Predictably, she betrays him. Bruno then is imperiled because he lives exclusively in the image world. The inadequacies of knowledge based exclusively on images is a constant concern of Godard. His critiques of this knowledge have often taken the familiar form of the demonstration that the real nature of an object cannot be discovered by examining its surface, that the soul of a person cannot be discovered in the face, the inside cannot be known from examining the outside. But Godard has articulated this argument in a number of ways, each with its own tenor. Sometimes, in the case of Vivre sa vie, he seems to argue that knowledge of another's inner life is difficult, certainly, but not impossible. About the division of that film into tableaux, he said, "This division corresponds to the external view of things which could best allow me to convey the feeling of what was going on inside. The greatest tableaux are portraits. Velasquez, for instance. A painter who tries to render a face only renders the outside of people, and yet something else is revealed. It's very mysterious. It's an adventure. The film was an intellectual adventure. I wanted to try to film a thought in action, but how do you do it?" Similarly, one recalls the line of the film, "If one takes away the outside, there is the inside. If one takes away the inside, there is the soul." But the emphasis of the film does seem to be on the difficulties of knowing another's internal world. The film begins with shots of Nana, Anna Karina, many taken from behind her head, which, like so many other shots of Nana, are backlighted. As a result, her face, when seen, appears only in unrevealing silhouette. The backlighting thus serves to prevent the viewer from knowing Nana. Even the marvellous scene in which Nana writes a letter of application depends for its humour on the distinction between the way one sees oneself and the way another sees him. Anna describes herself objectively, in the same way another person might. She even attempts to measure herself using her own body as a gauge. The humour and pity, for the scene is, in a very special way, a very sad one, depend upon the implausibility of the task of objective self-description, a task that Godard sees as implausible as using an object to measure itself. More often, however, Godard despairs over the impossibility of even penetrating beyond the appearance of the other and discovering his real nature. Breathless, for example, is fundamentally a film about the treachery of appearances. The many allusions to Cubist art in that film suggest the chaotic instability of appearances that have lost their grounding in spiritual reality. In Masculin Féminin, Godard presents a critique of cinéma vérité. While the film primarily attacks the practice for its assumption that film can present objective truth free of any ideological contamination, it also suggests another criticism. Cinéma vérité, it suggests, is wrong in trusting the veracity of images and appearances. A similar idea is suggested by a scene in Une Femme Mariée, in which Charlotte questions Robert about acting. Charlotte is anxious about whether Robert really loves her or whether he is just acting as though he does. To determine the answer, she asks him questions about his profession, acting. Robert hesitates and stumbles in formulating his answer. Because he hesitates and stumbles while speaking, he appears to be presenting his own views. But we must wonder, is this genuine? Is Bernard Noël actually giving us his own views? Is this appearance merely a contrivance on Godard's part? Or perhaps is Bernard Noël giving us his version of what he imagines Robert might respond? The answer, of course, cannot be given, for one knows only the part and not the players. One knows only the appearance, not the reality. There is a similar scene in Une Femme est une Femme, in which Alfred tells Angela that he loves her. She replies that she does not believe him. To demonstrate why, she asks him to tell her a lie. He complies with her request. She then claims her point has been proven, for, she points out, the expression on his face was the same when he uttered both sentences. Alfred objects, saying you just have to know when a person is lying and when he is telling the truth. To this, Angela replies, of course you know, but others aren't obliged to believe, and it's a shame because it means everyone is out for himself. The comment reveals that Angela's sense of solitude, perhaps like Godard's own well-known feelings of loneliness, follows from the fact that we cannot know other people's feelings, since these feelings are not reflected in their outward appearances, and since the other is experienced as inaccessible, as alien, they are sometimes felt to be, as Angela suggests, indifferent or even hostile. Recognition of the fact that the other is unknowable results in the feeling that one is alone in the world, that in this world it's every man for himself, as the title of another Godard film has it.
Toutes les femmes de Manet ont l'air de dire « Je sais à quoi tu penses ». Sans doute parce que, jusqu'à ce peintre, et je le savais par Malraux, la réalité intérieure restait plus subtile que le cosmos. Les célèbres et pâles sourires de Vinci et de Vermeer disent d'abord « moi », et le monde ensuite. Et même la femme à l'écharpe rose de Corot ne pense pas ce que pense l'Olympia. Ce que pense Berthe Morisot, ce que pense la Barmède des Folies Bergères. Parce que le monde, enfin, le monde intérieur, a rejoint le cosmos. Et qu'avec Édouard Manet commence la peinture moderne, c'est-à-dire le cinématographe.
آره کسی میگفتش که عشق نتیجه سوء تفاهمه و ما میریم برای اینکه سوء تفاهم بکنیم. وقتی به تفاهم میرسیم، وقتی واقعا درک میکنیم، اون موقع عشق در واقع به زوال میرسه دیگه، پایان عشقه. همه ارزش‌ها رو ما به اون میدیم و خودمون رو درگیر میکنیم و طبیعتاً به این پاسخ یک غیر قانع کننده، برای اینکه دلمون نمیخواد واقعیت رو بدونیم، وقتی به تفاهم برسیم اشتباه میشه. بنابراین به یه اعتباری آره عشق نتیجه سوء تفاهمه. وقتی آدما رو نمیفهمیم عاشقشون میشیم، ولی وقتی که به واقعیتشون پی میبریم بعد میفهمیم که اینو نبوده. یعنی عشق یک توهم بیشتر نیست و
The importance of this idea in Godard's works explains the frequency with which he employs two formal devices. One is the use of pairs of characters with opposing characteristics. In Breathless, for example, Patricia is American, female, and as an aspiring journalist, respectably middle class. Michel is French, male, and a petty crook. Again, in Pierre le Fou, Marianne is female, tough, hard-nosed, and materialistic. Ferdinand is male, soft, dreamy, and idealistic. Masculin-Féminin is structured entirely on the contrasts and tensions between the male characters and the females. Such structures reflect the belief that the other is remote, alien, hostile, feelings that follow directly from the belief that we know only the appearances of other people, that their real nature is unknown. The other feature I wish to mention has also been described often enough. Despite this, I believe that its importance has not been correctly understood. The feature that I am referring to is the use of images that in one way or another affirm their two-dimensional nature. Godard employs a vast number of devices to achieve this. He incorporates graphic images or texts into the work. He uses images with a shallow rather than deep space, or images in which the majority of forms lie parallel to the picture rather than intersecting it at an angle. He uses frontal lighting and primary colors to suppress the suggestion of depth by modeling, and finally, as Henderson has so well demonstrated, he employs tracking shots in which the camera moves nearly parallel to the plane of the action. Godard, it seems to me, uses the form to express what some might consider petty bourgeois sentiments. After all, two-dimensional images are images that arrest the viewer's gaze at their surface, and it seems to me Godard employs this formal structure to suggest our inability to penetrate beyond the surface of things to their essence, to penetrate beyond appearances to reality, beyond the face to the soul.
What would you like us to remember?
I'd like you to remember you. I'm glad when they say, this picture, I thought of myself and I'm thinking, and well, that's all. I received something, and I'm glad to take it with me because I still exist. So I'm glad when you say that you still exist after seeing one of my pictures. My postcard was not, was useful then, because maybe you forgot you exist.
Les îles Hawaï. La chaîne montagneuse des Andes. Le Cap Canaveral et le centre spatial Kennedy, le bord de Taft. La Floride du Sud, le bleu foncé du Gulf Stream et les récifs turquoises des Bahamas. Les immenses cratères des îles Galapagos. Et le soleil qui aujourd'hui se lève pour la 16e fois.